Okay, once we've set up our program, we can do some movement to make our graphics move. We're going to start with some simple left-right movement schemes, and I will create some additional movement videos to show you other options that you might want to use to create different types of game situations. Let's take a look at our code. In the last videos about setting up, I suggested you could probably set up the bad guys yourself if you weren't able to draw the bad guy on the screen. You needed to create the variables for the bad guy's width and height. You needed to create the bad guy's location, which I just set at 0, 0. Maybe I'll set it at 50, 50, so it's down a little bit. And I needed to draw the bad guy to the screen. Here's where we needed to use the enemy's location, just like we use the player's location. One note on the locations that I messed up on. This is called a tuple, which I kind of suggested last time as something that's neat that we could use. I was wrong. We actually want to use a list. A tuple is called an immutable object in Python, which means once you create it, it does not change. That's not good for the location of something we want to be animated on our screen. A list can change, it's mutable. We should have used a list all along. That's fine. Alright, let's move on to movement. First thing we need to do for movement is we need to be able to detect our keyboard. Secondly, we need to be able to create a function to actually move. And while we're doing all of this, we need to think about what variables we might need in order to move. Well, we have the player's location, but what about the player's speed? What his current speed is that he's moving. So let's create a variable for player speed. Over in my variable list, I've already added it, player speed. Now you could do a player speed as a float, which means it doesn't have to be a real number. It doesn't have to be an integer. It can be a number that uses decimals. We are going to set it to be 0 because we're not moving at the beginning of the game. Now, separate from how fast the player is currently moving is how fast you want the player to actually move once you do start to move. We're going to make that a separate variable. We're going to, in fact, make it a constant because every time he moves, we want to move him a certain amount of pixels. This way, if you put it up here as a constant, if you change your mind and want to make him move faster, you just come right up here, you say, no, 5's slow, 10's better. So you do that kind of thing. So that's the two main variables that we're going to need. We may think of another one later, but right now we're good. Let's go ahead and set up our system for detecting keyboards. So we're going to create this. Alright, these are just built-in functions that Code Sculptor uses to let us set the fact that it's going to look for key downs, look for key ups, call this function key down when that happens, call this function key up when that happens. Now we'll create those functions. Again, this is something that happens automatically, but the key is the key that's coming, the variable that's coming into this function automatically from simple GUI, just saying, hey, they pressed a key on the keyboard, here's what it is. And all we have to do is say, if that key is equal to something. Now you might think I can just say, well, if the key is equal to A, but no, unfortunately you can't. as far as the computer's concerned, it just sent an electrical signal to through the keyboard. We have to tell it how to interpret that electrical signal, so they have created in Code Sculptor something called a key map. So we say if that signal is mapped in your little system to the letter A. Just I guess semantics. Alright, what do we do if they press the A key? Well, that means we're ready to move left, which means our player is ready to have his speed adjusted. So what should his speed be? Well, you might think, oh, I want his speed to be 5, or maybe even -5, because it's to the left, which means it has to get less. But remember, we set up a constant, and that's where that's going to come into play. So we're going to say that. Now we'll move to the right. Now the player speed is going to equal positive speed. Because it's moving right, it needs to get larger. The key up handler is very, very simple. It's exactly the same thing. I would copy and paste if I were you. We just say in this one, hey, here's our little comment that we're doing key up. The name of the function is key up. And this time, if the key has been released, what's the player's speed going to be? Well, we want them to stop moving. Stop moving. Set them back to 0. Alright. Now the program knows to look for the keys. It needs to change player speed. Oh, what does it need to do though? If player speed gets changed, it needs to change player speed throughout the whole program, which means those are global variables. Global variables, there we go. Player speed is a global variable. Throw that into key up as well. Otherwise, it just wouldn't work. Alright, here in our draw function, we don't want to put movement inside a draw function. But this function is the one that runs over and over and over again in a loop. So we're going to sneak a function in it that says, hey, why don't you go ahead and move the player while you're after you draw him. Now, what needs to change in the move player? Think about this. This is the location that it's currently drawing the image. So if we change the location after it moves the player and it goes through a loop, it'll say, the player's at a new location. I'm going to draw it over there. And we'll go through the loop. So that's why this is happening like this. This is not a handler function. It is what we might call a helper function. So it might not even be called a helper function. It might be just called a main function because it's kind of important to the game, but that's okay. So we are going to define our move player. This time I'm going to remember to call it a global. Just as a note, in a previous video I had called it player location. I got sick of typing location, I renamed them. So if you're following along on something you've created already, you may want to double check that when I say loc down here. This function is actually ridiculously simple. And lots of times we build functions like this that are nice and simple. Our player location is going to change. So you might say, okay, we're going to change our player's location by the player's speed. So we add the player's speed. Remember, if the player's speed is negative, I'm going to add a negative, which means it will go down. However, the player's location is actually a list of two values. Those two values are its x value and its Y value. X is the first value in the list, which means it's at position 0. So we are going to move left and right. We're not going to move on the Y-axis. So we don't want to change the whole location. We only want to change the location at position 0. Now, if I did everything right the first time, we're going to press this button, and we're going to do it. We can move. It feels pretty nice and responsive. I like it. I feel like we're located in the right position on the screen. So we have some simple player movement. Notice we can go off the screen. So we may want to program that. That'll be a little bit later. Right now, I think we can call it a successful program.